Hey guys, it's me, and today I'm here to talk about Terminator Genesys. Ugh. Oh gosh. I guess that basically sets the tone for this video for you. Now for those of you who are new to my channel, I did a review for this movie at the time, and if I remember correctly, even though I had some problems with it at the time, I actually didn't really hate it. I actually kind of enjoyed it. Now, having some time to process it, in case you haven't seen it, there are spoilers, so let's talk about Terminator Genesys. So basically, it takes the same story of the first film, where you have John Connor leading the Resistance on a final mission to destroy Skynet, but then they discover in a last-ditch effort, Skynet sends a T-800 back in time to kill Sarah Connor, the mother of John Connor, in order to prevent John Connor's existence and therefore ensuring the survival of the machines. So in order to stop that, Kyle Reese, played by Jai Courtney, is sent back in time to 1984 to protect a young Sarah Connor, played by Emilia Clarke. But then when Kyle arrives in 1984, he discovers that the whole timeline has been altered and it's not what he expected, because Sarah Connor, instead of being the young, timid, and scared waitress, she's actually more like what we saw from her in Terminator 2, because she's been raised by a reprogrammed T-800, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, that was sent to protect her when she was a young child. So now they have to figure out a way to stop Skynet in what turns out to be a very crazy, insane, and very confusing time travel adventure. Basically, this movie tries to be like a course correction of sorts, considering the responses to Terminator 3 and 4 being lukewarm at best, and tries to do the X-Men Days of Future Past or the Star Trek 2009, where it acknowledges the previous two films, but then it sets up an alternate timeline, and therefore this is not going to be the same story. Now the concept, I don't think is a bad idea. If they had a good way of explaining it, maybe I would have been okay with it, and maybe other people would have been fine with it, but as we'll get to later on in the review, it's really messy. Although, that being said, I would say that as a movie itself, it's not terrible, but it's not that good. As a Terminator movie though, then I would say that it's awful. This is by far the lowest of the low that has ever come out of this franchise. The creative choices that were made, the filmmaking, the inconsistencies that it sets up with its time travel elements, and the fact that it doesn't take any time whatsoever to explain any of them. This movie is a huge mess that I'm actually stunned it got the seal of approval to be released to the general public. So the movie opens up with a narration by Jai Courtney, who plays Kyle Reese, telling how he met John Connor growing up in the ruins of LA, and then we also see him storming the Skynet headquarters with John Connor and the other members of the Resistance, preparing to go back in time through the time capsule to protect Sarah Connor from the Terminator. This section of the movie, I would say, is okay. Not good, but not terrible. It's decent at best, I would say. The dialogue does come off like it was written by a 10-year-old, and some of the performances, particularly with Jason Clarke, which don't get me wrong, I think he's a fine actor from what I've seen, and similar to Emilia Clarke as Sarah Connor, we'll get to her in a minute. Watching him talk with Kyle and the other Resistance members, it just feels like that he was reading lines. But then there's also the photograph of Sarah Connor that we saw in the first film. Continuity-wise, that doesn't add up, because if you remember from the nightmare that Sarah had in the first film, the picture actually burns up, and this is supposed to take place right before Kyle gets sent back in time. How could that picture have survived that firefight? It's a small nitpick, but still, like, no, that doesn't make any sense. And also the look of that picture, it looks like a really bad Photoshop edit. But like I said, this opening is okay at best, and I like that it ties in to the events of the first film, and it does feel like what more than likely happened before Kyle Reese landed in 1984. We get to see why Kyle Reese had this big landing on the concrete like he did, where he just went splat, and how Arnold had this big dramatic entrance when he arrived at the Holmes Observatory in LA. It's something that didn't really need an explanation, but I do like that they gave that kind of attention to detail. So Kyle and the T-800 arrive in 1984, and seeing how certain scenes play out, it's basically a recreation of those scenes that we saw in the first film. But instead of doing it in a way that feels like it's tributing the first films, it just feels weird. This whole movie feels like a giant fan fiction. And some of the line delivery, it's so obvious that they're just doing it just because, oh yeah, remember that scene from Terminator 1?
Nice night for a walk, eh?
Nice night for a walk.
The CGI face for the young Arnold actually doesn't look that bad. There are a couple moments where it does look a little off, but for the most part, it actually does look good. Then you got Kyle Reese trying to avoid this police officer just like he did in the first film, except the cop this time is a T-1000 trying to kill him. And then Sarah shows up in this big giant SWAT van. This is not what you expected, Kyle. Everything's changed now. Meanwhile, at the observatory, an older Arnold T-800 shows up and fights the younger T-800. I remember actually being kind of excited that we're actually going to see young versus old T-800 fight against each other. But what we get is a pushing contest. And whenever the older Arnold's in a fight, it's an obvious CGI double. I find that fight sequence to be just atrocious. Just awful. And as it turns out, Sarah was raised by the older T-800 who came back to protect her when she was a young child. And after they avoid the T-1000 and killing the young T-800, they try to explain to Kyle Reese that this is not the same future that we saw in the original films and that everything's different because Arnold being sent back in time splintered the whole timeline. And also because as Kyle was going back in time, Matt Smith's character grabs John from behind and saying, "Did you think that was going to be that easy?" As we see later in the movie, it was actually Skynet hiding in plain sight, trying to use some kind of a failsafe as best as he could, which doesn't really make sense considering that he also sent a T-1000 back in time to the 90s to kill a young John Connor, just in case the T-800 sent to the 80s failed in its mission to kill Sarah. You with me so far? Because up until then, the movie wasn't that good to begin with. But then once they head back to 1984, that's when this movie takes a huge nosedive. And me trying to explain the time travel mechanics that Arnold tries to explain, I'm not going to try to explain how I think it's connected, because I was watching this movie with my roommate who's also a good friend of mine. So many times he audibly said, "Wait, what? What is going on here?" Not to mention the fact that Kyle starts having flashbacks to him as a young kid, but instead of growing up in the apocalyptic Los Angeles, it's actually a timeline where Judgment Day does not happen in 1997 or 2004 as we saw in the previous films. Now, okay, time travel, it's very difficult to pull off correctly. It takes a really special kind of person to make it seem as tangible and legitimate as it could be. That being said, no matter how you construct it, there's always going to be these little things that you pick apart and complain about. But there are some previous examples where they do give a lot of good attention to detail. This movie, not so much. When you do a time travel movie, you gotta take liberties with logic. And even in any movie, you have to suspend your disbelief on some level. But how exactly is a guy having flashbacks to a life that he never lived? And the one Terminator that's there in the movie is saying something like, "No, Kyle Reese is remembering things that doesn't happen because of a different time thing or whatever." No. You're losing me here. And according to the director, Alan Taylor, who actually made Thor: The Dark World, he also directed a few episodes of Game of Thrones, which oddly enough stars Emilia Clarke as one of the major characters in that show. There was an interview where Alan Taylor said, "Oh, the time travel stuff's not important because you don't need the time travel elements to have fun." Really? What are you talking about? The whole movie is about time travel. Most, if not all, the dialogue is about the time travel stuff. None of which you guys gave a lot of thought to. Again, I know that you have to suspend your disbelief on any movie on some level, but when you go this far with the time travel stuff, and you tell your audience you don't need the time travel stuff to have fun, just go with it, that tells me you have no respect for the audience that's watching it. This is the same guy who did Thor: The Dark World and complained that Kevin Feige was too controlling, which is why the movie didn't turn out the way that it was supposed to, and yet he went on to make a movie that was so universally loved by critics. I'm not trying to sound disrespectful to Alan Taylor. I'm not familiar with his work, but I just find that to be pretty ridiculous when you see how his filmography turned out after Thor: The Dark World. Then you got Sarah Connor, played by Emilia Clarke, who I will say, she actually looks the part very well. Performance-wise, to me, it feels like a really bad impression of Linda Hamilton. I'm not trying to disrespect Emilia Clarke. I've maybe seen little bits and pieces of Game of Thrones. I haven't watched it yet. I also saw her in the Han Solo movie. She's not that bad of an actress from what I can tell. I just think that, unfortunately, some of the projects that she's been a part of haven't really done her much favors. I like that she's capable, she can fend for herself, she doesn't really need anybody's help. But like with the previous Terminator film that I mentioned, where the characters need a more development, that's the same problem in this one. There's not a whole lot to them, especially with Kyle Reese, who... Okay. Hold on a minute. Alright. I'm fine. Jai Courtney plays Kyle Reese. I have nothing against Jai Courtney as a person. As an actor, though, I don't think he's that good. Except for movies like The Water Diviner or Suicide Squad, the latter of which he was probably one of the more better aspects of that movie. We'll talk about that at a later time. But as I was watching the movie at the time, and even watching it now, all I could think of was, why did you cast Jai Courtney as Kyle Reese? Like, couldn't you get Anton Yelchin to come back? Or couldn't you get somebody who resembles Kyle Reese? Jai Courtney is horribly miscast as this character. Instead of being the scrawny, frail human being that we saw in the previous films, now we see somebody who's very well nourished, has all this muscle, is some kind of a Prince Charming. No. That's not what Kyle Reese is supposed to be. Not only does he not look anything like Kyle Reese, he acts nothing like Kyle Reese either. He's not the hardened, scarred warrior who's fiercely loyal to John Connor, although, yeah, they do get it in this film. It doesn't feel natural in this film. It just feels very kind of blah. And he comes off as more of an annoyance than a heroic figure. Then they decide they have to go to the year 2017 to stop Judgment Day from happening, which is now, as this new timeline has established, is supposed to happen in that year. Thanks to the new program, Genesys, that's going to link everybody's iPads and computers to their phone. We already have that stuff in today's world. The iCloud, iTunes, They go to the year 2017, the day before it's supposed to go live, where they've already got the products in all the stores that it's supposed to be selling in, instead of staying where they're at in 1984, or at the very least, going to a time period where the idea is about to be born. Why limit your time window instead of just staying where you're at or going to a certain time where the idea is about to be conceived? It's just those little things that could have saved it in some way, but they just didn't think of it. Then when they arrive in the year 2017, they get arrested by the cops, they're sent to a hospital where all of a sudden, John Connor shows up, seemingly okay, but then it's revealed, as Arnold shoots John, it turns out that John is a Terminator. Just when you thought that this movie couldn't get any crazier, John is made into a T-3000, an experimental Terminator by Skynet. The movie just went from bad to worse. Making John Connor a Terminator? Are you out of your minds? You hype up John Connor to be the savior of the resistance, and in this movie, you make him a Terminator, and there are no consequences to that? It's just treated as like a, oh, whatever, just go with it. Hey, wouldn't that be cool if John's a Terminator? If you're gonna do that to a character like John Connor, you have to give us a good reason for that. It's like if The Force Awakens had revealed that Luke turned out to be the new Emperor of the First Order, after seeing everything that he went through in the original 3 films, beating Darth Vader and the Emperor, only to turn around and say that he's actually become the bad guy again 30 years later. That would have been a gigantic middle finger to the character. Similar thing with John Connor in this one. And also, another question that I have, if John was stopped by Skynet right after Kyle went back in time, who sent back the Terminator to protect a young Sarah Connor when she was a child? The explanation that they give is that those files have been erased. Wait. Don't tell me you were going to explain that in the sequels. This is different from something that opposed to, like, Luke's lightsaber in the sequel trilogy, even though it didn't really get explained in The Rise of Skywalker. Let's say that if it did, the fact that they don't explain it in The Force Awakens, that's different because that's a small detail, and that can be explained. I'm sorry I went on a bit of a tirade just now. To be realistic, there are some things in this movie that are not bad. Not terrible. Arnold has his moments. There are times where he's funny.
It is nice to meet you. Are you kidding me?
It's the classic Terminator performance that we've seen from him, so in that respect, he's doing his best, especially with the crappy script that he's got to work with. And also, J.K. Simmons shows up in this movie as a veteran police officer who actually ran into Kyle Reese in the 1984 scene where he saw the T-1000, and for years he's been trying to convince people that what he saw was real, and everybody thinks that he's crazy. That is probably like the most interesting aspect of the movie, trying to prove to somebody that what you saw was real, but nobody takes you seriously, just like with Sarah in Terminator 2 when she was locked up in a mental institution. Barely gets touched on, though. J.K. Simmons, the guy's a great actor, and with what he's got to work with, he does his best. This was right after his Oscar win for Whiplash, and yeah, he's wasted here. And even though a lot of the action in here is really bad, there is one mildly enjoyable action scene on the Golden Gate Bridge where they're driving in the school bus and all of a sudden it does this big cannonball in the air. That I would say is not too bad. Unfortunately though, a lot of the action that followed up after the first 2 films, I understand that, you know, especially after Terminator 2, how would you do an action set piece that lives up to that film? And the first one. I mean, you don't need to hear me say it. Those first 2 movies, they're just about as perfect as you can get. So the T-800, Kyle and Sarah have to go to Skynet headquarters to blow it up, and John Connor shows up to try to stop them, revealing his endoskeleton, and there's a big fight between the older T-800 and John Connor, and they blow the whole place up, which they manage to stop Judgment Day. But then, Arnold goes into the liquid metal that's right by the system core, and then he comes out of it as a T-1000. What? How does that even work? Oh my god! Oh my god! Are you kidding me? So they manage to stop Judgment Day, and Sarah and Kyle give a message to the younger version of Kyle Reese in this new timeline, and they ride off into the sunset with a very seemingly hopeful future in front of them, only to have it revealed in a mid-credit scene that Skynet is still active. But thank all things holy that we did not get a sequel to Genesis. Oh my god, this movie. I've said it before, but I would rather watch Terminator 3 and 4 over this movie and Dark Fate any day of the week. I don't think 3 and 4 are necessarily great, but at least they feel like a natural progression of the Terminator films after the events of T2. And at least it does try to respect the legacy of the first two films while still trying to continue the story after Terminator 2. But this movie to me feels like a giant fan fiction, and it makes no attempt whatsoever to explain all the consistencies that it brings up. They might have had good intentions for it on paper, but it falls extremely, extremely flat. And almost nothing in this movie works. And if any of you guys out there like it, hey, be my guest. More power to you. But on my end, I actually kind of hate it. So those are my thoughts on Terminator Genesys. What are your guys' thoughts on the movie? Do you love it, like it, think it's alright, or do you hate it? Whatever the case is, comment below and tell me your thoughts, and I will see you all very soon.